April 29th, 2022. Florence, Alabama. The Lauderdale County Detention Center. A 56-year-old woman stood in front of her colleagues at her own retirement party. She had served 17 years. She had won Employee of the Year 4 times. She was about to receive it for a 5th time. She raised her glass. And the craziest part? She had already sold her house. She had already bought a getaway car. And in less than 2 hours, she would walk a 6'9" convicted killer out of that jail and disappear with him forever. Her name was Vicky White. His name was Casey White. They were not related. They were not married. But for the last 2 years, they had been speaking on the phone almost 1,000 times in secret, planning the most shocking escape in modern Alabama history. But this isn't just a story about a love affair gone wrong. It's about a model employee who told her coworkers, with a smile, that she was going to go out with a bang. It's about a 6'9" convicted killer covered in white supremacist tattoos who convinced his jailer that he was innocent. And it's about a woman, dead in a car somewhere in Indiana, with a single gunshot wound to the head that nobody can fully explain. A woman once sold her 4-acre home for less than half its market value. Less than 2 weeks later, she was running from the FBI through 4 states with a man who had told her on a phone call that anyone who came within 300 yards of their hiding place would be shot. This is the story of Vicky White, Casey White, and the 11 days that ended with one of them dead and the other in chains. Casey Cole White was born in 1984 in Alabama. He grew up rough. By the time he was an adult, he stood 6 feet 9 inches tall. He weighed over 300 pounds. His arms, his neck, and his chest were covered in tattoos. Some of them were ordinary, others were not. He had a Confederate flag tattoo with the words, "Southern Pride." He had 2 stylized SS letters in the style of the Nazi Schutzstaffel. He had a swastika. By 2015, Casey White was 31 years old, and his record was already long. That year, he committed a rampage that would put him in prison for the rest of his life. It started with an argument with his ex-girlfriend in Limestone County, Alabama. He showed up at her home. He fired shots into the house. The bullet struck a woman inside. The family dog was killed. Then he ran. Over the next several days, Casey White went on a violent crime spree across northern Alabama. He broke into a home. He stole a vehicle. He committed a second carjacking. He kidnapped a woman during one of the carjackings and forced her to drive him. He fired more shots. He led police on a chase. He resisted arrest. When officers finally caught up with him, they tackled the 6'9" fugitive to the ground and put him in handcuffs. In 2019, Casey White was convicted of attempted murder, kidnapping, robbery, burglary, animal cruelty, and several other felonies. He was sentenced to 75 years in prison. He was sent to the William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility in Bessemer, Alabama, one of the most violent prisons in the state. Donaldson held some of Alabama's worst offenders. It was a place where men disappeared from public memory. He should have stayed there for the rest of his life. Then, in 2020, something changed. From inside his cell at Donaldson, Casey White wrote a letter to a Lauderdale County investigator. In the letter, he confessed to a murder. He said he had stabbed a 59-year-old woman named Connie Ridgway in her apartment in Rogersville, Alabama, in October 2015. The murder had gone unsolved for 5 years. The Ridgway family had given up hope. Now, suddenly, they had a confession. Casey White was charged with 2 counts of capital murder. The charge in Alabama could carry the death penalty. He was transferred from Donaldson to the much smaller Lauderdale County Detention Center in Florence, Alabama, where he could be held while he waited for his trial. He arrived at the Lauderdale County Jail in October 2020. That was the month he met Vicky White. Vicky Sue Davis White was born on August 19, 1965, in Alabama. She grew up quiet. She finished school. She got married in 2002 to a man named Tommy White. She kept his last name. The marriage did not last. Tommy struggled with alcohol and drugs. They divorced in 2006. They had no children. But Vicky never stopped caring about him. She visited him. She called him. When he died in January 2022, just 3 months before the escape, she grieved him like a husband she had never really stopped loving. She also had a job she was extraordinarily good at. For 17 years, Vicky White had worked as a corrections officer at the Lauderdale County Detention Center. She rose through the ranks, By 2022, she was the Assistant Director of Corrections, the second highest position at the facility. She managed staff, she managed inmate transports, she managed schedules. She had won the Employee of the Year award 4 times. She was on track to win it a 5th time. Her colleagues loved her. Her supervisors trusted her. The judges and lawyers who passed through the courthouse knew her by name. Even the inmates respected her. One former prisoner said she was like the mother that everyone in there never had growing up. A prosecutor named Chris Connolly, who had worked with her for 17 years, told reporters after her death, "I never thought it could happen in a million years. I would have trusted her with my life." But under the surface, Vicky White was lonely. Her marriage was long over. She had no children. Her ex-husband was dead. Her job was her entire life. After her shifts, she would go home to an empty 4-acre property in the tiny town of Lexington, Alabama. She would eat dinner at her mother's house next door. She would walk her dog. She would have a drink, then another drink, then another drink. She would go to bed alone. And then, in October 2020, a 6'9" inmate walked into her jail. The relationship between Vicky White and Casey White did not start with a kiss. It started with conversation. Casey was charming when he wanted to be. Other inmates would later say he had a way of getting on the good side of the staff. He told Vicky his side of the Ridgway story. He said he had only confessed because he wanted attention. He said he had not actually killed Connie Ridgway. He said he was an innocent man being railroaded by an Alabama prosecutor. Vicky believed him. She began giving Casey special privileges. Extra food on his tray, extra time outside his cell. Other inmates noticed. One inmate later told investigators that Casey had handed Vicky letters with no addresses written on the envelopes. Vicky would slip them into her pocket. She mailed them herself, on her own time. In early 2022, Casey White was transferred back to the larger Donaldson facility, while still awaiting his Lauderdale County trial. The two were now hours apart by car, but the relationship did not stop. It exploded. Over the next 2 years, Vicky White and Casey White exchanged nearly 1,000 phone calls. Vicky bought a burner phone. She called Casey at the prison's inmate phone line. The conversations were recorded by the Alabama Department of Corrections, like all inmate phone calls. Investigators would later listen to all of them. Hundreds of hours of recordings, some short, some long, some heated, some intimate. Some of the calls were romantic, some of them were sexual, some of them included phone sex. Sheriff Rick Singleton would later confirm this detail to reporters with obvious discomfort. On one call, Casey said, "You're my queen. You're everything to me. I know you're a few years older than me. I don't care about that, baby." Some of the calls were arguments. Vicky was angry that Casey was still using methamphetamine inside the prison. She accused him of getting high while she was risking her career for him. He apologized. He promised to stop. He never did. Other calls were practical. They talked about money. They talked about cars. They talked about where they would go after the escape. Casey wanted to go to Tennessee. He wanted to disappear into the deep mountains. He told Vicky, on one of the recorded calls, "We'll go up to Tennessee, into the deep woods. We'll never be near anyone again for the rest of our lives. Anyone who comes within 300 yards will get shot." He also talked about something else, something more romantic. He said, "We're going to have fun on the adventure. We'll never look back at little old Alabama. Then we'll travel around the world on a sailboat." A sailboat. A man with a swastika tattoo and a 75-year prison sentence talking about a sailboat. She believed him. She believed all of it. She believed he was innocent of the Ridgway murder. She believed he loved her. She believed they were going to live in a cabin in the mountains and then sail around the world. She believed in a future that did not exist for either of them. In early 2022, 2 things happened that pushed Vicky toward the edge. Her ex-husband Tommy died in January. The grief opened a hole inside her. And then, in February, Casey White was transferred back to the Lauderdale County Detention Center to prepare for his upcoming murder trial. Casey was now under her direct supervision again. The plan moved into its final phase. In the weeks before the escape, Vicky White began making preparations that should have alarmed everyone around her. They alarmed no one. On April 18, 2022, she sold her 4-acre home in Lexington, Alabama. The market value of the property was around $235,600. She accepted $95,550 in cash. She sold it for less than half of what it was worth. Anyone looking at the transaction should have asked one question. Why would a woman about to retire sell her home in such a hurry, at such a loss? Nobody asked. She moved in next door to her elderly mother, Pat Davis, who had no idea what her daughter was planning. Pat would later tell CNN, "She would come home after work, eat supper at my house, and pick up her dog. She'd walk her dog, and that was her routine every day." It looked like a quiet retirement. But Vicky was busy. She bought a 2007 Ford Edge under a fake name. She bought several handguns. She bought men's clothing for Casey. She bought wigs for herself. She bought adult store items. She withdrew tens of thousands of dollars in cash. She filed her retirement paperwork. Her official retirement date was set, April 29th, 2022. In the days leading up to that date, Vicky talked to her coworkers about her retirement plans. She said she was going to take a beach trip. She said she was going to relax. She said she had earned it. And then, with a smile that nobody understood at the time, she said one more thing. She said, "I'm going out with a bang." Her colleagues laughed. They thought it was a joke. They thought she meant a big retirement party. They thought she meant a celebration. They were wrong. The morning of April 29th, 2022, Vicky White's last day on the job. She stayed at a Quality Inn hotel the night before, just outside Florence, Alabama. The night of the 28th, she had driven the orange Ford Edge to a parking lot at a shopping center about 10 minutes from the detention center. She parked it in the section reserved for cars for sale. She did not put a for sale sign on it. A passing shopper noticed the unusual placement. He would remember it later. Then she drove back to the hotel. She slept for a few hours, or maybe she did not sleep at all. In the morning, she dressed in her uniform, black jacket, black pants, her blonde hair pulled back. She drove to work for the last time. She walked into the detention center. Her coworkers had organized a small retirement party for her. There was cake, there were cards, there were hugs. Her colleagues told her how much they would miss her. She smiled. She thanked them. She said goodbye. At 9:30 a.m., she walked over to the booking desk. She told another deputy that she needed Casey White prepared for transport. She said he had a mental health evaluation scheduled at the Florence courthouse. After that, she said, she planned to stop by her own doctor's appointment because she was not feeling well. Standard jail policy required 2 deputies to escort an inmate during a transport. Vicky was going alone. The deputy hesitated for a second. Then he did what he always did when Vicky White gave an order. He followed it. She was the assistant director. She was the employee of the year. She had been doing this for 17 years. Who was he to question her? Casey White was brought out in handcuffs and leg shackles. He wore an orange prison jumpsuit that did not fully cover his white supremacist tattoos. The surveillance camera in the corridor caught the scene perfectly. Vicky held the door open for him. Casey shuffled past her in his chains. He climbed into the back seat of the patrol car. Vicky climbed into the driver's seat. She started the engine. She drove out of the Lauderdale County Detention Center for the last time. A Florence City Council member named Bill Griffin was filming a campaign commercial outside that morning. He looked up as Vicky's patrol car passed him on the street. He recognized her in the driver's seat. He saw the inmate in the back. He waved at her. She did not wave back. That was the last confirmed sighting of Vicky White as a free woman doing her job. Within minutes, she pulled into the shopping center parking lot. She parked the patrol car. She walked Casey to the orange Ford Edge. She uncuffed him. He climbed into the passenger seat. She climbed into the driver's seat. She turned the key. They drove north. By the time the Lauderdale County Detention Center realized what was happening, Vicky White and Casey White were already gone. Casey did not show up at the courthouse. There was no mental health evaluation scheduled that day. Vicky did not return calls. Her phone went straight to voicemail. 6 hours passed before her colleagues understood what had happened. 6 hours of head start. The U.S. Marshals were called. The FBI was called. State troopers were called. A nationwide manhunt was launched. Vicky White was initially listed as a missing person. The early theory was that Casey had taken her hostage. He was the dangerous one. He was the killer. She was the dedicated officer with 17 years of service and a chest full of awards. That theory lasted about 48 hours. Then, investigators began pulling the records. The phone calls, the burner phone, the house sale, the Ford Edge purchased under a fake name, the men's clothing, the wigs, the cash withdrawals, the retirement paperwork. Vicky was not the victim. Vicky was the architect. On May 2, 2022, an arrest warrant was issued for Vicky Sue White on charges of facilitating the escape of a felon. The case was upgraded from statewide to nationwide. Sheriff Rick Singleton stood in front of the cameras and said the words that nobody who had worked with Vicky could believe. He called her the mastermind behind the whole plan. He said he was behind bars. He really couldn't plan too much behind bars. She arranged, purchased the getaway car, she sold her house, got her hands on cash. She just obviously put the plan together. Casey White didn't escape from the facility. He was basically just let out. The story exploded across American television. Cable news ran the photos in a constant loop. The 6'9" tattooed inmate, the blonde grandmother in her corrections uniform, the shocking match, the disappearing patrol car, the phone calls, the retirement party, the line about going out with a bang. Reporters dug into Vicky's life. Neighbors were interviewed. Coworkers were interviewed. Her elderly mother was interviewed. The picture that emerged was almost more shocking than the escape itself. Nobody had seen this coming. Nobody. Not the prosecutors who had worked alongside her for nearly 2 decades. Not the deputies who had taken her orders every day. Not the inmates she had treated like a mother. Not her own family. The Ford Edge was found in Williamson County, Tennessee, abandoned in a tow lot. It had been towed on the day of the escape, before anyone even realized it was a getaway vehicle. The tow truck driver had marked it as an abandoned car. He had no idea who had been driving it. Vicky and Casey had switched to a 2006 Ford F-150 pickup truck. They were heading north. They were checking in and out of motels along the way, paying in cash. Vicky was wearing dark wigs to hide her blonde hair. Casey was trying to keep his face hidden under hats and hoods. The trail led to Indiana. By May 9, 2022, the U.S. Marshals had narrowed down their location to the Evansville, Indiana area. A vehicle that matched the description of their latest car, a Cadillac, had been spotted at a local motel called the Motel 41. A deputy at a nearby car wash had recognized the vehicle from a news bulletin and called it in. The tip was solid. The location was confirmed. The task force began to mobilize. The U.S. Marshals coordinated with the Vanderburgh County Sheriff's Office and the Evansville Police Department. They surrounded the motel quietly. They positioned tactical vehicles. They prepared to move in. When Vicky and Casey saw the police vehicles closing in, they did not surrender. They ran for the car. They jumped in. Casey took the wheel this time. He turned the key. He floored the accelerator. The Cadillac shot out of the motel parking lot and onto the road. The U.S. Marshals and local sheriff deputies gave chase. The Cadillac raced through the streets of Evansville at high speed. Vicky was in the passenger seat. She had a loaded handgun in her lap. She picked up her cell phone and made a 911 call from inside the moving car as they were being pursued. The recording captured her voice in the final moments of her life. She was not calm. She was not in control. She was panicking. She told the dispatcher to get the police to back off. She said the deputies were going to ram them. She said the airbags would deploy and kill them both. She shouted at Casey. She shouted at the dispatcher. She shouted at no one in particular. She said, "Stop. The airbags will go off and kill us. The airbags are going off. Get out and run." A sheriff deputy made the decision in real time. He drove his vehicle into the side of the Cadillac. The collision was deliberate. It was a pit maneuver designed to spin a fleeing vehicle off the road. It worked perfectly. The Cadillac spun, hit the curb, and flipped into a drainage ditch. The airbags exploded inside the cabin. The car came to a violent stop. For a moment, there was silence. Then the deputies moved in. They had their weapons drawn. They approached the Cadillac slowly. They shouted commands. They could see movement inside. Casey White was pulled from the driver's seat. He was alive. He was conscious. He was bleeding from cuts on his face, but he was not seriously injured. The deputies forced him onto the ground. They put him in handcuffs. He did not resist. The first words out of his mouth were not about himself. He looked up at the deputies. He asked, "Is my wife okay? Is my wife alive?" She was not his wife. She had never been his wife. They had not even shared a last name by accident long enough for it to mean anything. But in that moment, that was the only word he had for her: wife. Vicky White was found inside the car with a gunshot wound to the head. The wound was self-inflicted. The handgun she had been holding during the 911 call was beside her. Whether she had pulled the trigger deliberately or whether the weapon had discharged accidentally during the crash would become a subject of debate. The Vanderburgh County coroner officially ruled the death a suicide. Some of her former colleagues disagreed. They said the angle of the wound looked strange. They said it looked more like an accident than an intentional act. Either way, the result was the same. She was rushed to Deaconess Hospital in Evansville. The doctors worked on her for hours. She died of her injuries that evening, just after 7 p.m. She was 56 years old. Inside the Cadillac, investigators found multiple firearms. They found about $29,000 in cash. They found several wigs. They found bags of clothing. They found everything two fugitives needed to keep running. Everything except a future. Casey White was returned to Alabama in a convoy of armored vehicles. He waived his extradition hearing. He was charged with first-degree escape. Under Alabama's felony murder rule, he was also charged with the murder of Vicky White, since her death had occurred during the commission of his crime. In May 2023, he pleaded guilty to first-degree escape. The murder charge was dropped. In June 2023, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will be eligible for his first parole consideration on January 1st, 2061. He will be 76 years old. At his sentencing, Casey White stood up in the Lauderdale County courtroom. He looked at Vicky White's mother, Pat Davis, who was sitting in the gallery. He said, "It wasn't supposed to go that way." He said, "I loved Vicky, and I wouldn't drag her name through the dirt for anyone in this courtroom." He said she was the first person who had cared about him in 6 years. He said her only regret was leaving behind her family. But there is another version of Casey's story, a version that did not appear in his sentencing speech. A retired Vanderburgh County Sheriff's Office major named Jason Ashworth conducted the first interrogation of Casey White after his arrest in Indiana. He told ABC News what Casey had said in that interview room. According to Ashworth, Casey made it clear that Vicky had no future with him. Casey had a destination in mind, a spot in the mountains. And once they got there, once Casey felt like he had made it to safety, he was planning to kill Vicky. She was a liability. She was someone who could be questioned. She knew too much. The woman who had sold her house, abandoned her career, and risked everything for him was supposed to be murdered as soon as she stopped being useful. Casey's lawyer denies this claim. He says Casey loved Vicky. He says Casey is in love with her memory to this day. The truth, like so much of what happened in those 11 days, is something that only one of them survived to know. Vicky White was buried in Alabama. About 200 people came to her funeral. The 5th Employee of the Year award she had been on track to receive was quietly canceled. Her name was removed from the honor wall at the detention center. Her 17 years of service were not so much erased as overwritten. She was no longer the assistant director who had given her life to the job. She was the woman who had thrown all of it away for a man who had planned to kill her. In September 2024, Netflix released a documentary called Jailbreak: Love on the Run. It told the whole story: the phone calls, the retirement party, the chase, the crash, the interrogation. Within days, Vicky and Casey White were back in the headlines, 2.5 years after the manhunt had ended. But there is one person whose name almost never appears in the documentaries, or the news stories, or the timelines. Connie Ridgway. She was 59 years old. She lived alone in a small apartment in Rogersville, Alabama. Her family described her as a sweet, patriotic mother who never forgot a birthday. On October 13, 2015, she was found stabbed to death inside her own home. The case went cold for 5 years. Then Casey White confessed in a letter from prison. Then he recanted. Then he was transferred to Lauderdale County to face capital murder charges. He never faced those charges. After his life sentence for the escape, prosecutors dropped the Ridgway case. The state did not have the resources to pursue a death penalty trial against a man who was already going to die in prison. The Ridgway family agreed to the decision. They issued a brief statement. They said, "Casey White is right where he belongs, in Donaldson Prison." But Connie Ridgway never got her day in court. Her killer, whoever it really was never officially named. Her story was eclipsed entirely by a love affair between a model employee and a 6'9" convict. Her death became a footnote in the story of the people who escaped because of her death. Vicky White is buried in Alabama. Casey White is serving life without parole at the William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility, the same prison he had been in before the entire chain of events began. Connie Ridgway is buried in a grave that her family still visits, with a question that will never be answered carved into every visit. Vicky said she was going out with a bang. She did. The bang was a gunshot in a crashed Cadillac in a ditch in Indiana, 11 days and 300 miles from the detention center where she had won 4 Employee of the Year awards. She got the ending she promised her coworkers, just not the one any of them had imagined. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.